Today Matter.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference, colloquium. My starting point really is a point of excitement with issues emerging around the decolonization process in Africa in general. My research relating to that process as it related to Zimbabwe or Rhodesia. One of the things that struck me initially, especially following the declaration of UDI on 11 November 1965, is that the reaction of the African countries to it was almost prompt. Although it may have been varied, but it was prompt and quick. And those countries that took a proactive role in dealing with Rhodesia experienced something catastrophic. And this relates to two countries in particular, Ghana and Nigeria. When Nkrumah took the decision to cut diplomatic relations with Britain over UDI, when he also advocated for the formation of a military campaign against Rhodesia, he was immediately overthrown in a coup in February 1966. Equally, when the Nigerian president at that time, say Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, held a Commonwealth meeting to deal with Rhodesia, a few months later, if not a few days later, not months, he was overthrown in a military coup. So these two events in relation to Rhodesia actually activated my interests, partly because I had been working on the external networks of liberation movements in Rhodesia at that time. So I was motivated to try and find the reason why there is such a coincidence in the declaration of UDI and the occurrence of coups in two of the most vocal countries relating over the issue of UDI, that is Nigeria and Ghana. I don't claim to have the answers at the moment, and what is interesting at this particular time, as far as the historiography and the research around the subject of UDI is concerned, is that we have had in the past few years an upsurge in primary material relating to Rhodesia that was previously unavailable. And most of this primary material is actually material based on intelligence sources. And if you look at it, PD, CIA, the American intelligence agency, PD, the Portuguese intelligence agency, I think SAHS, the French intelligence agency, and more recently, CIO in Rhodesia, and part of the cables leaving Rhodesia to diplomatic missions in Australia, Canada, and other places. We've come to review very, very, very interesting aspects about the operations taking place during this time. And my paper, as it's been forming itself, has tried to understand why, and in fact, the implications of this literature as it has emerged. So, I begin with a discussion of Rhodesia prior to the declaration of UDI. And my impression and my argument thereof is that Rhodesia had always intended to be a local superpower in Africa. And this was based on the desire, long-standing desire from the early 20s of transforming Rhodesia into a dominion along the lines of Australia, New Zealand, or even Canada. And how this desire or this dream was also influenced by proximity to South Africa, to the extent that, therefore, that dream was pursued with the idea to amalgamate all the white interests in Central Africa and transform this into a white island. So they first clearly attempted this endeavor was obviously the issue relating to the Congo crisis, where Rhodesia since 1958, or Southern Rhodesia since 1958, had envisaged a scenario where the southern part of Congo would be integrated into the Central African Federation, and in the long term become a bigger federation. So Rhodesian interests had been represented in what was known as the Katanga lobby, and this was motivated by the simple fact that Rhodesian railways, Rhodesian interest in mining, particularly in copper in northern Rhodesia and parts of Katanga, had always favored a scenario where Rhodesia would benefit directly from these resources. And this was not helped by the fact that the leader of the Federation, Roy Welensky himself, was keen on pursuing this despite what Tinashe was saying about Macmillan's position, that naturally colonies were becoming expensive and that Britain was not very much interested in this kind of adventures. So between 1958 and 1959, actually, Welensky goes ahead to actually talk about discussions, or to be involved in discussions that would see Rhodesia receiving, to use that term, receiving Katanga into the Federation. And in all these negotiations, it turned out that the proposals were being made with a view to also win over a potential African ally in the name of Moise Tshombe. And at that time, well before the crisis of 1960, following the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, it was clear that Rhodesia would go ahead and actually invite the Katangese into the Federation. But this idea was stopped naturally by eventualities that took place from 1959 onwards in the form of the 1959 emergencies that affected northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, and southern Rhodesia. And this, again, was militated by the fact that the Federal Army was too small to deal with the volatile situation emerging from the 59 emergencies, and also in attempting to deploy in Katanga to defend Katanga from secession or from the attack or attacks that were coming in as a result of the UN involvement in the Congo crisis. So this is what actually stopped the Rhodesia from annexing Katanga. But Rhodesia itself had made efforts to even establish military bases, air force bases, even in Ndola. And the death of the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, actually took place in Ndola, a few kilometers away from the Rhodesian air base at the border with Katanga. So this is the first initial stage that I discussed in the paper relating to this endeavor by Rhodesia to become this kind of superpower. But as we drift towards UDI, which is basically the theme of this conference. I try and not repeat what I've done in other papers that I've already published by looking at the divisions within the OAU as it was formed around 1963. I focus on 1966 as the key date that accounts for all these eventualities, where after the declaration of UDI, we see these coups taking place. But more importantly, we see that following the decision to actually declare war on Rhodesia, not all African states actually signed or participated in the resolution or complied with the resolution. And the decision itself, despite these coups, was not even followed up. And of all the 39 member states of the OAU, only 9 complied. That is Tanzania, Ghana, Mauritania, Mali, Congo, Brazzaville, Guinea, Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan. And this happens at a time when another element actually shows division in the African states. And it involved Rhodesia directly. At this time, it also involved Rhodesia being on the offensive. And this involved the Biafran War, which took place between 1966 and 1967. It might be necessary to also mention at this stage that one of the reasons why Nigeria itself took a very, very proactive role against Rhodesia, even after the fall of Tafawa Balewa, it was because the first bomb to be dropped in Nigeria by the Biafrans was actually made in Rhodesia. Secondly, Rhodesians continued to supply Biafran Air Force with what we called B-26 or B-26 bombers. And Rhodesian pilots and mercenaries offered their services to the Biafrans. But again, the Africans or the African states were divided in their support to Biafra. Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, and Zambia actually recognized Biafra, and it is given that their main reason was humanitarian. They were concerned with the kind of atrocities that the Nigerian government was committing in this war. That's what they frequently cited as their reason, although there are divisions that can be outlined. In fact, I do outline them in the paper more in greater detail. The point being that Rhodesians at this stage were taking advantage of fissures within African states to also deal with issues that had to do with the sanctions busting. And Biafra offered some of these opportunities, such as the oil had just been discovered in Biafra. As I will mention now, in relation to another element, it was also the role of the French in sanctions busting that counts. And this is what I'm going to turn to now. As far as the French are concerned, their relations with Rhodesia have been well covered by Joanna Wasson in a PhD thesis. And one of the arguments she pushes is that France came close to Rhodesia for the simple reason that it was concerned with the Anglo-Saxon dominance of former French sphere of influence or former Francophone Africa. It was concerned that the USA and the CIA were now firmly established in the Congo and behind Mobutu. They also realized that Britain had established a naval base in Malagasy to intercept Rhodesian oil deliveries via the port of Beira. So in the 1960s, France had begun to move to establish triangular relations involving itself, Francophone Africa, and minority-ruled Southern African states. And Rhodesia was an important element in this. So again, my interest is to relate this to the divisions in the OAU. The major critics of the UDI were radical francophone African states, such as I said earlier on, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and Mauritania. And in fact, the most vocal of them all was the president of Congo Brazzaville. His name was Masemba Dibat, Alphonse Masemba Dibat, who was president from 1963 to 1968. But despite this seeming opposition, and despite some of them having even signed Resolution 253 of the United Nations on sanctions onto Rhodesia, France managed to work through what it called its African friends. And these were Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Ivory Coast, and Omar Bongo in Gabon. And this relationship grows to become quite pronounced from 1967 onwards, when and in 1969 actually the Gabonese received a delegation of Rhodesians in their capital, and the Gabon leader Omar Bongo actually declares that Gabon is on the side of Rhodesia publicly. Pick Vanderbilt, I don't know whether he was the defense minister or the minister of information then, but I think he was defense minister, actually established serious contact with Gabon. Meanwhile, France was, I think it was Gary who was talking about the Air Force. France was supplying and servicing Rhodesian Elliott helicopters. And somebody has argued that by 1980, Rhodesia or Zimbabwe then had the best, well-serviced and well-maintained French helicopters at that time, precisely because of this kind of connection. Most of you might have lived in Rhodesia at that time. You remember that Peugeot, Renault, and Citroën were the cars to go with. And these were the most popular in Rhodesian roads. So France also took advantage of this to even, recognize Biafra to the extent that it endorsed a kind of Rhodesian presence there as well. Not to mention, obviously, that French mercenaries were an integral part of the Rhodesian light infantry. So all these things, to me, speak to the ability of the Rhodesians to work around some of the limitations that they had locally, but more importantly, to establish connections internationally with the elements that would, boost their sanctions-busting program. But again, when we continue the story of Rhodesia and Africa, one of the subjects that I think is significantly ignored is the role of Malawi in this whole picture. And I think from 1964 onwards, it is very clear that Banda is very, very, overt, and it comes out openly that military intervention in Rhodesia would be foolish, and it would not work because he thought Rhodesia was by far the most militarily superior power over any other African state, and he made this very clear in many ways. And he went out of his way to even befriend Portugal, and he was hostile to Frelimo, arguing that the Portuguese had actually changed their attitudes towards their Africans in Mozambique, so there was no need to actually fight them. And more importantly, he maintained diplomatic relations with both South Africa and I think Rhodesia, and obtained lots of support, financial support at that time when he was relocating the capital to Lilongwe. In fact, he gets more than 8 million rand from the South African government to that endeavor. So the point that I really want to emphasize is that in this kind of relationship, especially with Rhodesia, was Banda being pragmatic? Was he being the odd one out, or are there any other explanations? And one of the explanations that I come with is that it's clear from the cabinet crisis of 1964 that Banda actually believes that the rebellion is fomented by communists or elements that had been in contact with China in particular, having been behind this attempt to remove him from power. But even if we come up with that sort of answer, it's difficult also to understand why Banda is also hosting some African liberation movements. And speaking for ZANU was at the time between 1964 and 1965, when it was not really accommodated in Zambia, it established its headquarters in Malawi. And in fact, it received lots of protection from the Malawian young pioneers, and they boast even today that their first Land Rover was bought by Kamuzu Banda. So these are the contradictions that come when you really try and understand how Banda was relating with the fellow African states at this time. And then the other issue, which I will not repeat, is what Tinashe has already mentioned, relating to the role of Portugal. And I think there's been lots of literature that has emerged recently, in particular with relation or in reference to the Alcora exercise, which was all about a unified strategy to confront, liberation movements between South Africa and Rhodesia and Portugal. And it would support Portugal in maintaining military campaigns in the region. But the problem then was that Portugal had a vast empire on the one hand, and it was not physically present to actually manage that process. And this left the responsibility of, sponsoring this exercise to South Africa, and the responsibility of actually or actuating the operations to Rhodesia. And by 1974, when the coup happens in Portugal, it puts to an end the whole, it deals a serious death blow to the whole Alcora exercise. So the independence of Mozambique in this case is what counts. And it really leaves Rhodesia vulnerable. And it brings in the fifth point that I discussed in the paper more in great. I don't know how I'm doing for time. It's the second last point that I'm just going to make. Okay, so it opens up the question of the role of the frontline states. And in dealing with the issue of the frontline states, I borrow a lot from an old argument that was put in place by Masipula Stole way back in the 1975, where he argues that in any assessment of frontline activity in conflict, there are others that are more frontline than others. In any frontline conflict, and he singles out Zambia as being the frontline state compared to the others, for the simple reason of the strategic dependence of Zambia on the Rhodesian economy, on the role of Zambia in hosting liberation movements, not only Rhodesian ones, but several others at the Liberation Center in Lusaka. This then gets us to an issue relating to something that Zambia pushed in the frontline state agenda, which came in the form of the Lusaka Manifesto of 1968, And it seems to give the impression that the frontline state... 69, yes, sorry about that. 69, and it seems to give the impression that the frontline states themselves would prefer a more peaceful, transition in Southern Africa based on negotiation rather than on armed confrontation. But again, this is negated by the fact that the liberation movement themselves are not inclined to such an approach. And on the one hand, on the other, the intransigence of the white minority regimes, it deals a death blow again to this manifesto. So Zambia being the frontline state in this case, it left it also vulnerable to Rhodesian bullying for the simple reason that since the declaration of UDI, and when you read the biography of Ian Smith, you can see the level of contempt. For instance, at the attempt to airlift oil, and how he mocks Harold Wilson for even thinking about that, and how so much money is wasted or put into construction of alternative access to the sea and things like that. But the point I really want to emphasize is that right up to Lancaster House, Smith continuously uses this as a weapon. In fact, at the point of negotiation, just before the Commonwealth Conference, Smith had successfully bombed all the access to the Zambian economy, to the point that Kaunda almost capitulated. And this is a weapon that the Rhodesians continuously used, and Smith in particular took advantage of. So Mozambique comes into the picture by flexing its muscle and closing the border with Rhodesia. But more importantly, and I think Professor Shubinier could come in handy with this, the Cubans also enter or come to Maputo around 1977, and they serve as liaison and actually come up with a plan of invasion of Rhodesia from Mozambique. Unfortunately, it is not acceptable to ZANU, but they had already, it's called the Vivo Plan, and they had already come up with this, and they believe that this would be the best way to actually take over Rhodesia. For that reason, Mozambique had to be punished, and this is the basis on which I think Renamo comes into the picture, and that's the last section that I deal with in my paper. There is new literature obviously emerging on not so much Renamo, but people who participated in its formation, apart from the intelligence work of people like Ken Flower and others. But if you look at this literature, it stretches into the new nation state that becomes Zimbabwe, and how it becomes a problem which requires a campaign, not only to deal with the insurgency, but to save Frelimo. And in fact, if you look at the whole idea, Renamo had been formed to destabilize Frelimo for the purposes that Frelimo was serving in hosting liberation movements in Mozambique, and opening up the greater part of the border to operational work by these liberation movements. So my conclusion really is that the outcome of the history of the struggle in Zimbabwe is very much embedded in a bigger view of understanding the role of Rhodesia in dealing with Africa on the one hand, but dealing with immediate neighbors that had come to threaten its continued existence. But from the beginning, Rhodesia itself had attempted to have its presence felt throughout Africa since UDI. And I think when the final paper comes, it will have much greater detail than that I have given here. This is just an overview of how I intend to frame it, and I will welcome any interventions, any suggestions for sources, and places where I can get more information. Thank you.
Gerald, thanks. Just pick up on one small point. Is there concrete evidence of French technicians and support personnel in Rhodesia as such? You mentioned that the Alouette, or the French aircraft, Alouettes, but helicopters in particular, had the reputation of being maintained. My evidence has suggested that much of the maintenance was done by South African crews, and in fact some of it was tasked out to private enterprise, a company called Atlas in South Africa as well. So I'd be interested to know if there's evidence of actual French personnel on the ground in Rhodesia. Of course, another aspect of the French involvement, which you might have mentioned, but this is Sue's territory, I guess, is the active recruitment of mercenaries, French mercenaries. The French authorities turned a blind eye to that, as did so many other Western countries.
Right. Thank you for that. Should I respond now? Okay. Yes, I think from what I've encountered in the work of Joanna Wasson that I was quoting, there's a French presence in Rhodesia, not only in the military but in the civilian aviation side, where I think the French airline, I don't know if it's Data or what, I can't remember the actual name of is directly involved. And Afret Air, the main airline that's used to bust sanctions carrying meat and flowers via some of these francophone countries like Gabon and even some Middle East countries like Oman, are actually French owned, and they are pointers to that effect, that they are French personnel on the ground, although this is covered up internationally. Yes, I can share that with you. So very interesting.
I have a quick question. First of all, you mentioned the presence of Cubans in Mozambique. How large was the Cuban presence, and was a viable invasion of Rhodesia from Mozambique? Could it have happened? Was it considered the highest levels of Cuban military decision making? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. The reference to the Cuban presence is, and I think Professor Shubin could probably help with that. You can't, okay. But it is part of a bigger plan involving I think the Cuban Foreign Secretary. His name was Vivo, and he came up with this plan to deploy in Mozambique with a view to launch an operation that would create initially a liberated zone according to the Castro approach.
What year was this?
77. Yes. And by 1978, the plan was actually advanced from the sources that I've read. Except that the Vivo plan intended to establish an interim government with Joshua Nkomo as the leader and Robert Mugabe as the deputy, and he rejected it. And in fact, one of the reasons that they also rejected it was they feared that if it became clear that the Cubans were directly involved in the conflict, it would be another Angolan case. And the Zanla High Command and Mugabe himself actually rejected the plan. Initially, it was a liaison. It was a liaison. Yes, it was a liaison where an office was set up, and this office actually managed to provide funds and equipment through that liaison office for ZANU. No regular. I think this was envisaged, and in fact, it was rejected because it would have that impression. One of the things that features in ZANU's external missions is an attempt to second all these people to various missions. And a biography of one of these external missions person, he became an ambassador after independence, was actually a secondment to Cuba. And he went there. And he confirmed this in documentary evidence.
Sure, thanks. I was just hoping you could unpack Malawi and Banda a bit more. You mentioned the cabinet crisis as perhaps one of the reasons for driving Banda towards Rhodesia, but I'm not sure if I'm entirely convinced by that alone, and I wonder if you have any other sort of...
I wish I could. I'm in the process of actually trying to understand what Banda was up to, but all I can do for now is map the kind of attitudes and reactions he had to, in particular African or Zimbabwean liberation movements. In the long term, it does seem he was friendly to Rhodesia, he was friendly to South Africa. And even by the time the Mozambican conflict escalated, Banda could easily be seen as complicit in many ways. So I wish I had more information, but this is what I have my thumb on right now. It's something that I've tried to pursue from Malawian sources, and I hope I can account for it. For now, I've just mapped his attitude.